Oh, it's just you. Hey guys, so you might be wondering why I look horrible. And if you're asking this, you're either stupid or you've been living under a rock for the past 3 months. Because I have been in quarantine. I don't know about you guys, but I've seen the headlines, and oh boy, I don't want to catch it. It's a new disease called TMK. I'm gonna put some footage up, but viewer discretion, it's quite disturbing.
Seen a rash of these lately. TMK.
TMK.
Too much Kirby.
Think you can't get too much of a good thing? Try new Kirby Superstar. It's full-blown Kirby, inflated with 8 Kirby games, bloated with 23 Kirby enemies, bulging with new Kirby powers.
Get him into observation.
New Kirby Superstar, only on SNES. Can your system handle it?
I don't want to become a gumball. I have been in my room for so long. I've learned every single language. I've rewritten all famous works of fiction. I even carved the Leaning Tower of Pisa out of bones. Don't ask whose bones. I've been living off nothing but pretzels and this weird liquid that's dripping from my wall. So I think that if I don't get out of here soon, I'm gonna go... Kirby. Despite the first game I ever played being Super Mario Bros. 3, there are several distinct times where I just wasn't playing Mario games. Particularly around a 3-year span where stuff came out, but I was too busy with school, karate, and a little thing called a PlayStation 3 to dedicate time to them. I didn't even get properly acquainted with The Legend of Zelda until middle school, when I beat Ocarina of Time, and it showed me what video games are truly capable of. Both of these are very near and dear memories of mine, and whenever we get to discussing Super Mario Bros. 3, and yes, eventually Ocarina of Time, I'll share my history with those games a bit more. But today, I want to focus on someone who's been there my entire life. From the moment I started playing video games when I was in kindergarten, all the way now. Being Glover, baby, yeah! I'm kidding, I actually hate you, Glover. Burn in hell. Today we're talking about Kirby. Kirby, from a historical perspective, has always been pretty well documented. Everybody knows the story of Sakurai working at HAL, conceptualizing a game franchise for all ages to enjoy, yada yada yada, and boom, Kirby was made. If you don't know the full story, I made a video about it a few months ago, so go check that out if you'd like. But today I want to focus more specifically on a very important game in the series. The one to become the golden standard of games moving forward, and responsible for defining the character's most iconic traits. Kirby's first home console venture, Kirby's Adventure. Much like the rest of the early series, Kirby's Adventure's development has been discussed at length in the past. The creator of the series, Masahiro Sakurai, has a YouTube channel himself where he discussed a lot of details surrounding it, so I'd advise checking his channel out if you want to hear it from him. Also, in general, as someone who has a vested interest in games, his channel's a treat, so I can't recommend it enough. The game started development very quickly after the original Kirby's Dream Land was released, and HAL Labs was still in hot water. The company wasn't doing too great at the time, and even though Kirby's Dream Land was a pretty big hit, it alone was not enough to save the company. During this time, a lot of assets from the development studio were seized. Sakurai reminisced about coming into the offices and seeing their PCs with repossession stickers slapped on them. So it's evident that HAL was a bit of a mess at the time. Seeing the success and popularity of his previous game, HAL told Sakurai to create Kirby's Dream Land on the NES, which, when you think about it, is a bit of a weird request. For one, why the NES? The SNES was already around, so why not use the newest hardware? Well, simply put, it was easier. They could more quickly create a game for the NES rather than having to become accustomed to the SNES's development environment. Not to mention that the NES had a proven audience, something that the Super Nintendo didn't really have quite yet. Sakurai believes that they had outright meant to port the Game Boy title to the console. However, it quickly became clear that bringing Kirby to the NES wouldn't be as easy as anticipated. By this point, a lot of gamers had already moved on from the NES. Not to mention that those who hadn't had likely played dozens of the NES's infamously difficult offerings. Kirby's Dream Land was received very well critically, but a frequent point of contention regards the game's difficulty. Many reviewers just found it to be way too easy. However, that was the intention of the title, a game for beginners to enjoy, but it was a point that just couldn't be ignored. For an NES title, Sakurai had to make a game more appealing to experienced gamers due to the high install base of the console, but at the same time make something as approachable as the previous entry. He never really specified what inspired this accessibility aspect, but I speculate it has to do with the fact that there are plenty of kids receiving NESs and Famicoms as hand-me-downs. As new hardware is released, the old consoles will be given to the younger siblings. You don't want to make a title that's so difficult it'll scare off potential future customers, so the balance between difficulty and accessibility was a massive hurdle for Sakurai and his team to overcome, and it wasn't as simple a hurdle to overcome as in Dreamland. Dreamland established the series' mechanics and the sorts, so it wasn't as simple as just removing Kirby's floatability or something like that. They had to iterate upon the formula established there in a way to keep experienced players engaged, while simultaneously not being intimidating for new players. Sakurai very quickly decided that rather than making the game more difficult, he should make the game more in-depth. The main conceit behind the first game is that enemies aren't always a bad thing to see. Even though, yeah, they hurt you if you bump into them, you can also use them as projectiles to defeat other enemies and sometimes to progress. It was very quickly decided that the new mechanic needed to spice up the experience, had to iterate upon the suck and blow mechanics from the original title, and from there it was quickly established that Kirby would simply copy the enemy's powers. Several drawings from the design document have been shown off over the years, even by Sakurai himself, and they display a plethora of abilities. A lot of them do appear in the final game, such as the ability to fly or to swim, which weren't meant to be copy abilities as far as I can tell, but drawn alongside the set to dictate which abilities from the original title would be returning. Aside from those more traversal-based abilities, the other abilities that would see implementation in the final game are Ball, here called Roll, Fire Breath, Ice Breath, Invincibility, Turning to Stone, and using a Hammer. The way that these abilities came to be are pretty easy to determine. Hammer was probably conceived as Kirby's nemesis, King Dedede, uses a hammer, so it only makes sense to have Kirby wield this weapon at some point. The others, however, feature more puzzle-solving applications. For instance, fire can be used to light a fuse, which is something displayed in another piece of concept art from this time. Ice reinforces the entire using your enemies as weapons idea, as it can turn them into powerful blocks that can be thrown into other enemies. Stone can be used to press down nails and the sort, so the challenge would be keeping the ability long enough, hence its more defensive properties. Turning into a ball is the only one that strikes me as not obvious, but even then it could be argued that due to Kirby's, let's just say, spherical characteristics, it isn't the most outlandish idea. In terms of scrapped abilities, we have a shocking amount to discuss. Starting with abilities that have similarly styled drawings, we have the ability to shrink, kick, make blocks, shoot lightning, stick to walls, and explode.
What the fuck?
Kick and lightning are pretty easy to speculate on. Kick in particular was likely revisited in Sakurai's next Kirby title, Kirby Superstar, where it got built upon to become the particularly famous fighter ability. Lightning, I guess Spark Attack, is pretty obvious as well, seeing as this was just iterated upon to become the Spark ability in the final game. What's interesting is that the drawing seemingly shows a behavior that more closely resembles that of the Beam ability, so this might have been an early version of Beam instead, but I'm leaning more towards Spark. The remaining scrapped abilities are far more interesting, as they don't really have an in-game equivalent, so determining their function or use is far more complicated. The most confusing one is probably the Explosion ability. It seems to describe the Crash ability, as Crash in the final game has Kirby, I guess, explode in a way, and destroy all the on-screen enemies. But Crash's appearance in Adventure is more like a fit of rage from Kirby, rather than a literal explosion. The cutting room floor speculates that this might have been an ability similar to Sleep, due to the word trap being written underneath the ability's name. Sleep is an undesirable copy ability, in the sense that it immobilizes the player and makes them susceptible to damage, and is often used as, you guessed it, a trap. So perhaps the intention was for Kirby to swallow something, like a bomb, and it causes him to explode and cause damage to himself? Something important to note is the fact that the name of the sketch is self-destruct though, which seems to imply that this was a move the player would manually activate. With this in mind, I think that the possibility of this just straight up becoming Crash is incredibly likely, and they probably removed the negative effect of Kirby assumably taking damage to make the already rare ability more desirable. Making blocks, on the other hand, is an ability that was probably scrapped due to a lack of utility. It describes itself pretty clearly. It gave Kirby the ability to spawn the star blocks at a moment's notice. But what function would they serve? Perhaps Kirby would make them for platforming's sake? Similar to how Steve works in Smash Brothers? But then again, most platforming challenges can just be flown over. You can't have Kirby spit them back out since the ability for Kirby to inhale is overwritten by his currently equipped copy ability. Unless you're to make the summoned blocks act as if they're the ice cubes Kirby can generate while using ice-based attacks? But that would effectively make the ice moves worthless, since you wouldn't need an enemy nearby to turn into a block, and it kind of gets rid of the expansion of Kirby's use of enemies as weapons seen in other abilities. I don't know if you guys realize this, but a lot of abilities in the game don't outright kill enemies, but turn them into new things for Kirby to use. Freeze and Ice turn enemies into powerful projectiles. Backdrop and Throw allow Kirby to shoot diagonal projectiles by, well, throwing foes. And that's not even mentioning the abilities that are limited in terms of combat utility. Ball is terrible combat-wise, and High Jump is incredibly situational at best, and is often used more as an improved jump. Burning, Tornado, and Wheel are all unruly to control, and are more closely used for their travel capabilities. Parasol, Needle, and Spark are more useful for their defensive properties, while Stone, Fire, and Laser are mostly used for their puzzle-solving abilities. That leaves Sword, Hammer, Cutter, Beam, and UFO as the only abilities that are outright designed to be used for combat. That doesn't mean that the abilities not expressly designed for combat don't have combat utility, just that they were designed for purposes beyond it. The ability to create blocks fits within none of these niches, and provides no interesting evolution to Kirby's gameplay mechanics. The practicality of this ability is limited without making other abilities outright worthless, not to mention it's just far less interesting than turning foes into projectiles. In case you can't tell, I'm glad that this ability was scrapped, due to the sheer quantity of issues surrounding its implementation. The ability to stick to walls is one that fits within the self-destruct and kick categories, since the purpose was kinda reworked to fit within another ability, but would later be expanded upon in a later title. Though it doesn't stick to walls, the ball ability allows Kirby to bounce off walls in the sword, which is what appears to be shown in the drawing. However, the ability to outright stick onto walls is something that would later see implementation, as in Kirby Superstar, the ability to stick to walls is an attribute given to the brand new Ninja ability. That said, the ability to stick to the ceiling is a trait not given to any copy abilities to this day, likely due to it being pretty useless. This one was probably scrapped due to a more extreme version of what we saw with the Make Blocks ability. Whereas that one has potential combat utility at the cost of making other abilities worthless, this is one where I don't think it's possible to make sticking to walls deal damage to foes. Therefore, it was scrapped. This last ability with an associated drawing is very interesting, as this one, from what I can tell, was actually in the game up until incredibly late into development, being the ability to shrink. I'll discuss more details about why I say it was around for so long, but unlike the ability to make blocks, I really like this one. It's a more interesting trap ability. It doesn't outright damage the player, though it presumably would have made the player more vulnerable to enemies. Not to mention, I think the utility of this ability speaks for itself. Kirby would have been much smaller so he could more easily evade damage, presumably at the cost of getting hit once or twice killing him. It likely would have been a really risky ability to use, with a high reward for pulling it off. Not to mention the possibility of designing secret areas only accessible through tiny corridors Shrink Kirby can fit into. This would have been so cool. I'll get into why this one was scrapped later on, but solely from a design and gameplay perspective, I think that this one's pretty badass and would have fit right in with the other 25 abilities. And that actually does it for cut abilities with associated drawings, but there are just a few more that have at the very least been mentioned before in interviews. As a matter of fact, they're from the same interview I used in my previous Kirby video. From 1993, and graciously translated by Shmupulations, it details 2 scrapped abilities. Firstly, the interview mentions an ability where Kirby rode on a rocket, which effectively sounds like the missile ability that would later see implementation in Kirby and the Amazing Mirror. The second ability similarly saw implementation in a future Kirby title, even down to its name. Iwata's quoted saying, "There was one called Animal too, where you can scratch and bite enemies." This was implemented pretty much verbatim into Kirby Squeak Squad for the Nintendo DS. I should note that within this interview, they mention the shrink and block creating abilities as other scrapped abilities. But what's interesting is the total amount of conceptualized abilities that are claimed to exist. The quote reads, "Originally, we had over 40 enemy abilities. From those, we selected the best ones, whittling it down to the final number you see in the game today. From here, we can determine a rough idea of how many remaining scrapped abilities we haven't heard about. The final game has 25 abilities, and assuming they each had their own sketch, that places 25 concepts as seen in a sense. Assuming that each of the abilities with drawings we've seen weren't reworked, that accounts for an additional 6, and then Rocket and Animal adds another 2 to the total. The over 40 metric provided means that it wasn't close enough to 50 to warrant a nearly 50, or claim to a similar effect, so I'm assuming that there was anywhere from 42 and 46 concepts in total. That means that there are anywhere from 9 to 13 additional scrapped abilities that we've yet to have publicly revealed. However, based on the fact that a lot of the abilities that were scrapped saw use down the line, I think that we can somewhat logically assume the identity of at least a few of these abilities. And hey, I don't want to be that guy, you know, making assumptions and all, but Cut abilities aside, there are a few more production drawings that show what copyability-centric puzzles could look like. This one shows a scenario that people who've played the game should be all too familiar with. Kirby lights a fuse to shoot a cannon, and he has to make a mad dash back to the cannon before the flame ignites it. This is a scenario that has appeared in, I think, every single Kirby game since, and for good reason too. It's a very creative way to encourage player experimentation with different abilities. You see a fuse, so think that you should light it using a fire-based attack. It's really natural, and I think it's a very well thought out scenario. Then there's this scenario that appears in drawings that actually doesn't appear within the final game, where Kirby sees a platform suspended with a rope and uses a sword to cut the rope, revealing a secret path. Despite not appearing in Adventure, this concept is something that, once again, was revisited and re-implemented when Sakurai began to work on the sequel, Kirby Superstar. Beyond early concepts for abilities and the such, the interview reveals a very interesting tidbit surrounding one of the most iconic aspects of the game, the minigames. Kirby games like Kirby Superstar, and most recently in Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe, they're particularly famous for their inclusion of subgames. Subgames are these microscopic minigames made as a distraction from the main quest. Usually it's either something based upon the core mechanics of the main game, like Gourmet Race, or sometimes it's an entirely unique gameplay style, seen in games like the Megaton Punch. Despite Superstar being the game that's most well known for its subgames, subgames are something that Sakurai actually created for Adventure. The final game features 3, Egg Catcher, Quick Draw, and Crane Fever, each of which are pretty different from the main game. Egg Catcher sees the player have to press the button to open Kirby's mouth and catch eggs. Quick Draw is a reaction game and sees how fast the player can press a button, and Crane Fever is a timing-based game, seeing if the player can successfully gauge how long a button needs to be held in order to grab a plush toy. The interview, however, mentions a 4th style of game that was scrapped, where it was seeing how many times the player can press the button within a certain amount of time. There are just a few more things I need to mention before I move on to discussing the pre-release content of the game, mainly regarding some of the challenges the dev team had to overcome during development. Well, beyond the pending bankruptcy thing. As I mentioned earlier, it just wasn't possible to reasonably take Kirby's ability to fly away, since Dreamland established that was his main shtick. You can't just backpedal on it and remove his most iconic attribute. And this isn't even taking into consideration that they're working with much larger displays than that of the Game Boy hardware. So the space in which levels occupy on the screen are much larger, and as a result of Kirby keeping his sprite from Dreamland, there was a lot of space on screen for Kirby to fly around in. This also notably made his flight ability even more overpowered than in the original game. Since the range of visibility is much higher, he can just fly over most enemies in platforming challenges. Whereas in the Game Boy title, that wasn't a concern since enemies are often positioned high in the sky to discourage players from just floating over everything. To make this issue slightly less prominent, they added the HUD scene at the bottom. That way the space Kirby can fly around in is smaller, while simultaneously providing the player with helpful information, such as which copy ability Kirby currently has equipped. To not make the world feel empty due to the larger screens, the game also notably features gorgeous background artwork for all the stages. At this time, it was tradition that the spriter themselves created the illustration for the backgrounds, within the hardware, and that's what stuck. Despite this, the spriters themselves usually have a greater focus on enemy and character design of the sort. Not to imply that classical game sprite artists can't do background art themselves, just that it was pulling from a separate set of skills. Instead, the development team had artists well versed in creating more natural environments create drawings that encompassed what they were looking for, while the designer went about taking their illustration and implementing it into the game. This is a practice that was incredibly ahead of its time, and is what's seen nowadays, that artists themselves are who creates the assets for the game, rather than a designer. Miyamoto in this interview even says that this is a practice he wants to see in games in the future used more often, so he had incredible foresight on that front. And that really does it for the development of Kirby's Adventure. But as you all should know by now, one of the best places to look for differences between development and the final release of the game is pre-release materials. Coughing up pink phlegm isn't a good sign, is it? Ugh. The pre-release materials for this game are quite interesting. As more so than games like The Legend of Zelda, it seems like there were a bevy of changes made incredibly late into development. It even appears that a handful of reviews of the game are based upon prototype builds, but I'll get more into that in a bit. We should start with what I presume is the earliest screenshot available of the game, which is from a 1993 Walmart holiday gift guide? Yep. However, there is a black and white version that comes from someone's eBay listing, which shows the image in much higher quality at the cost of color. With that in mind, I'm going to focus on this black and white one since we can more easily make details out. To be honest, the main takeaway is that this screenshot seems to be practically identical to the final game. The sprites are the same as they appear in the final, although this exact level layout doesn't appear in the final product. It most closely resembles 1-1, but has a few notable oddities, such as the background grass becoming screwy around the halfway point, the oddly segmented ground, and these mountain structures don't appear like that in the final version of the background. Beyond that, when you take a look down at the HUD, several additional differences become evident. To start with the obvious, the health bar was much different, shown here as stars. As we look at more screenshots from this section, more details surrounding how this health counter works would be revealed, but since I'm talking about it now, I'll go ahead and reveal the details surrounding it, and how it makes literally no damn sense. Okay, so each star is representative of 3 hits, meaning Kirby can get hit 9 times total. You go from 1 big star, to 2 little stars, to 1 little star, to none. The reason that this makes no sense is because multiple screenshots show these stars in nonsensical states. Okay, so this screenshot shows 2 big stars and 1 little star. So from that we can assume that the big stars would break up sequentially as the player's life depleted. What I mean is that you don't hop from star to star, breaking each one into the 2 smaller ones before looping back around and removing the stars, and looping back until the player dies. The stars would deplete based on which one's the farthest to the right, right? Well, that's exactly what I thought, until I saw this screenshot that shows 2 of the big stars split into the 2 tiny stars simultaneously. I just don't understand how this works. I have no idea what this could mean, to be honest. And if I had to guess, this is probably why it was replaced with the bar system seen in the final game. You can really easily determine how many more times Kirby can get hit without dying. While here I'm just confused about how the whole system progresses more than anything. It's also important to note that the final game only allows Kirby to get hit a total of 6 times before death, meaning that this change might have also been made to make the game a little bit more difficult. The HUD has another difference seen here, being this star counter seen above Kirby's life counter. Now, for some reason, a lot of discussion online seems to suggest that this may be tracked a collectible, since later games down the line would see Kirby collecting stars as his coin equivalent. Perhaps it was meant to appear here? Well, simply put, no, this is not representative of any potential collectible or anything, especially considering that this is something that actually appears in the final game, although it's only under certain circumstances. It only appears when Kirby has a limited use ability equipped, such as Mike or Crash, meaning that it almost certainly served a similar purpose here. If I had to guess, it was probably removed from the HUD unless the player had those abilities, since it could also confuse the player. Many would wonder what it represents, only for all their efforts to increment the counter not to do anything. So when it actually came into use when they had either Mike or Crash, they probably wouldn't have noticed the counter increase in the first place since they've become accustomed to ignoring it. Here's a recreation of the full HUD I made, including the animated stars as we'll see in a second. Here it is put over gameplay to show what it would have looked like, so yeah, I'm just gonna move on to the next set of screenshots. This next one is weird since the text blurb totally sucks ass. They get so much information incorrect that it is absurd. But before we talk about that, first the screenshots. The first one seems to showcase the same early version of 1-1 we discussed previously based on the segmented ground, but interestingly the background's different. It's missing the water seen in the final games in pre-release screenshot, which means that this might have been from a later section of 1-1, taking place in a totally different room, or an entirely different level. As a matter of fact, this background remains entirely unused in the final game. While yes, there are similar looking ones, there are none that feature the repeated mountains as a backdrop among the field of grass. This next screenshot shows a scenario with Kirby swimming around, and similarly to the previous screenshot, there are several levels that resemble this, but none that outright have the same layout. 1-3 is the earliest example of something resembling it. 5-2 has a similar looking background. 6-1 resembles the background in general idea, but features a notably more open design, as does 6-6. With that said, I don't think that we can necessarily dictate which levels either of these became, since they look so vastly different from anything that we see in the final game. And alright, we're taking a bit of a detour here, because this blurb is a source of a lot of misinformation surrounding Kirby's Adventure's development and Kirby as a whole. The blurb reads, you may have heard of Kirby. He's a chubby little ghost from the Game Boy romp Kirby's Dream Land. The handheld game is so successful that Nintendo's decided to produce an NES version. At last, we can see what Kirby looks like in color. Follow the lovable apparition as he floats through a world bulging with cute graphics, funny sprites, and cool animations. Levels are linked with entertaining animation sequences, showing Kirby puffing and panting as he floats, runs, and flies through the adventure. The NES game will be floating down onto a console near you very soon, and the Game Boy version is available now on US import. The chubby little ghost has 3 lives to get through a variety of scenarios. Gain extra lives by collecting stars! Above. Ghost and water don't mix very well. Kirby takes a deep breath and navigates the tricky underwater level. Okay, so first, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, guys, but Kirby isn't a ghost. This was a pretty common misconception back in the day, and I feel like this blurb in particular is to blame for a lot of this. Despite that, the big one here is the claim made near the end, that Kirby collects stars to gain extra lives, which I should reiterate is incorrect. Something you guys will start to notice is that across all these screenshots, the star counter never increments. It is constantly stuck at 0, so if we're to assume that the game featured stars as a collectible, at least one screenshot should have a total greater than 0, right? Not to mention, I don't think that we can really count this as a source pointing towards a collectible's inclusion, since the blurb gets several other things incorrect. I'm somewhat confident in saying that they just saw the star counter and made an assumption, so yeah. Oh wait, by the way, since the article mentions the idea that Adventure is a simple NES port of Dreamland, I have been cross-referencing the level design seen in these screenshots alongside the maps for Kirby's Dream Land, and I haven't found any matches. If something does come up, I'll mention it, but I didn't want to say that for every single screenshot since, oh, nothing's here, would get annoying to say over and over again. This next screenshot shows the same section from the previous one, albeit just a little bit further ahead. There's not really much else to say here, to be honest, just more of the same. However, I did edit the two together to create an extended version of the level. But yeah, I'm just gonna move on. These next screenshots are super interesting, as they actually come from an internal marketing guide. It once again features a screenshot from that exact same underwater level. And before you guys ask, yes, I did go ahead and edit it onto the other mock-up I made, so that way we can get an even better look at what this level could have been. The second screenshot is far more interesting, as it shows a level style that we haven't seen yet, being a beach theme stage. Unlike the previous levels, however, this one does actually have an in-game equivalent, seemingly being a slightly modified version of 2-1. The background has been shifted around ever so slightly. If you look closely, you can notice that the ocean was moved lower to reveal more clouds in the final game. Also, the leftmost palm tree seen in the final game is missing here. Beyond that, the layout itself is identical. The palm trees are the same heights in the final game and everything. What's interesting is the enemy scene here. A Mace Knight doesn't appear here in the final game. As a matter of fact, Mace Knights don't appear outside of the Meta Knight battle arenas found across the game, so it appears that Mace Knights might have originally been found in normal levels. And that does it for screenshots from the marketing guide, but at the bottom of the flyer it promises a major review of the game in the April issue of Nintendo Power, which we'll get into shortly since the Nintendo Power sections contain quite a few interesting things. Under normal circumstances, I would just go ahead and show the Nintendo Power screenshots. However, they're from a much later point in the game's development, seeing as they're just pulled from a straight-up review. Instead, I'm going to skip forward a bit and discuss the rest of the screenshots there from the same time as the previously discussed ones, before doubling back and talking about the Nintendo Power ones. With that said, I'm skipping to this one from Chili's Club Nintendo magazine, which is pretty much their Nintendo Power equivalent. It features two unique screenshots, one being the same beach screenshot from earlier. Weirdly enough though, the magazine has it twice, once on the right, and another time to the left below Kirby, which seems to imply that this picture of Parasol Kirby was straight up connected to the screenshot in press materials. On the bottom right, however, we have a brand new screenshot being taken by camera off a CRT, evident by the scan lines. This area, though, has no similar equivalent in the final game. Based on the fact that the above screenshot is 2-1 and this one is also beach themed, it might belong to an early version of it, but I don't know. The blurb itself doesn't say anything too interesting. I can understand Spanish pretty well, so I'll slap a pretty shitty translation I did on screen. It's just a basic plot summary and talking about how this is on the NES and not the Game Boy and some of the new features. Interestingly though, it calls Dreamland, the location of the game, Poo Poo Land, which is what it's called in Japan. These next ones are from EGM, and it calls the title simply Kirby's Dream Land. As a matter of fact, a lot of the details from their preview seem to be outdated, between the name of the blurb describing it as an enhanced version of the Game Boy title, and it boasting the addition of color as the largest edition, which is just incorrect based upon the final game. I wouldn't be surprised if they're basing this off early press details or something, but even from the screenshots it's clear that this is different from the Game Boy game. Anyways, the screenshots are both new this time. The one on the bottom showing an area from the water section that we've seen way too much. However, this isn't a part we've seen before, and it seems to show an area later on in the level. Unfortunately, we can't really place its location relative to the other screenshots, so I'm just kind of assuming it's from the same level due to the similar level design and background, but it's entirely possible that this is from a different level. Beyond that, the top screenshot shows a style of area that we've yet to see yet, taking place inside a castle setting. The cutting room floor prior to my research said that this design doesn't appear in the final game, but this is incorrect actually. Well, kinda. Level 3-2 has a room that looks similar but notably different, yet if you flip the map, it matches up perfectly. From the brick textures on the wall lining up, the colored blocks, everything here matches to a T. Maybe the room originally faced this direction, but an equally likely possibility is that EGM flipped the screenshot for some reason, which isn't an unfounded assumption to make. The screenshots have the HUD cropped out, which at first I thought was for spacing issues, but it would also make sense to crop the HUD out if you flip the screenshot, as the text would appear backwards. I don't know, but my point is that this area is in the final game. I went ahead and added that to the cutting room floor page for it, as well as the rest of my observations surrounding these screenshots, particularly surrounding which levels they resemble in the final game. Alright, so now we're on to the plentiful Nintendo Power screenshots, starting with these three which I find pretty interesting. The first screenshot looks like 1-1, but it still isn't the exact same. Notably the little yellow things, I don't know what they're called, are more numerous here than in any place in the final game, as well as the weird segmentation in the ground, and these additional platforms placed just where above the HUD begins. This second one doesn't resemble anything from the final game, however. There aren't many ice-themed areas in the first place, but what I find interesting is that the background here uses a bright blue sky, whereas all ice areas in the final game use either the Aurora Borealis-styled backgrounds, or are much darker in general.
Excuse me for 1 second.
Of course.
Oh, well, that was wonderful. Good time was had by all. I'm pooped.
Yes, I should be. Good Lord, what is happening in there?
Aurora Borealis?
Aurora Borealis. At this time of year, at this time of day, in this part of the country, localized entirely within your kitchen.
Yes.
May I see it?
No.
The final screenshot shows an area I know I've seen in the final game, but for the longest time I couldn't find it until I realized I was looking specifically for the isolated square at the top, and when I realized I should be looking for more details, I found it in 5.2. For one, yeah, the giant square is missing in the final game. But other than that, the screenshot is pretty much identical to the final, aside from some small differences seen in the patterns adorning the clay ground. Something interesting is that the ice screenshot gives us the first look at a HUD portrait that isn't normal old Kirby, showing us around half of the sword portrait. It looks pretty much the same as the final game, but what I'm more interested in is this weird thing. I checked the Spriters resource and parsed through the game's sprites and couldn't find this sprite anywhere in the final game. It kinda resembles the ball enemy hitting a wall, but that doesn't make any sense as they can't appear in water in the final game, and the sprite is overall different, so I have no clue. I might have just missed something somewhere, so I don't want to 100% proclaim that this is a cut enemy or anything, but I can't find what this is for the life of me. So if you know what this is, please tell me. This is driving me nuts. These next three screenshots are much lower quality, unfortunately, and I don't really have much to say about them. The first one shows a confrontation between Kirby and Wispy Woods, which is identical to the final game, beyond the HUD. The second screenshot is from another ice section, evident by the igloos, yet it doesn't resemble anything from the final game. It once again features a blue sky, which doesn't appear alongside the ice-themed areas in the final game. This last screenshot doesn't resemble anything seen in the final game, and it has this weird indent on the middle of the yellow thing. This might actually be a graphical error, or a smudge on the magazine this was scanned from, but I thought I should mention it since it caught my attention. These are the last pre-release screenshots, and are notably from a near, if not just straight up final build of the game. The leftmost screenshot shows 1-1 as it appears, and the final HUD seen in the game. That means that the stars have been replaced with these little tabs to represent health, and the star counter is removed and only appears when a limited use ability like Crash, Mic, and Light is in use. This next screenshot is much the same, except instead of being from 1-1, this is an area not seen in the final game, surprisingly. The scenario was seemingly moved to 1-2 in the final game, but there are plenty of differences, such as the background being different, the wall to the left being higher, and the battle arena being smaller based on the wall on the right. With that said, stuff on the right could just be garbage data generated by the NES due to the game having diagonal scrolling and parallax scrolling, but I could just be wrong. Now, even though that covers the pre-release screenshots, there is one more thing I need to mention that involves this blurb in particular. Below the pictures is a pro and con display, and the con section says this: "The theme may be younger than the challenge," whatever the hell that means, but after that it says, "The regular sized Kirby still seems small, and the tiny Kirby seems almost microscopic." Now, I don't know about you guys, but this text blurb seems to imply that there was an ability that made Kirby small, which can only mean that the shrink ability made it as far as being implemented before being removed for some reason.
Alright, I've been teasing this for way too long, so I think I'm gonna cut the crap and go ahead and start with... Okay. What the hell is this supposed to mean? Anyway, we're starting off with the scrapped Tiny Kirby ability.
In the game's data are about a dozen sprites relating to the scrapped ability, meaning between that and the Nintendo Power preview, that it was likely removed very late in development. The ability pretty plainly sees Kirby shrink down, with an associated animation showing him shrink. Interestingly, based on the absence of sprites for it, it seems that Kirby wouldn't have been able to float while in this form, only able to perform his basic jump. The code for the ability is pretty much all gone, but there are a few interesting things to note about it. For one, there's a sprite showing Kirby being able to slide in this form, which doesn't sound interesting on paper, but when the ability was finally added in Kirby in the Amazing Mirror, Kirby can perform that technique in his downsized form factor. Another interesting thing surrounding this has to do with which ability replaced this, likely being UFO based on how data is stored in the game's code. Without getting too much into it, the sprites for the different copy abilities are all stored alongside one another, specifically in Graphic Bank 80 up through Bank 99, all except for one, being UFO. This implies that the sprites were added later on from when all the assets were, and furthermore, UFO is contained within the last normal ability ID, which seems to suggest that it was added later than the others. Furthermore, a weird behavior I noticed with UFO is that when Kirby obtains it, he faces the player with his hand raised, which is an odd gesture. This doesn't make a lot of sense and is kind of unnatural, unless of course this was supposed to see Kirby transition into a shrinking animation. Now the big question that's been lingering over our heads since pretty much the beginning of the video: why was Shrink scrapped? Well, I think I found a pretty convincing culprit, and it's one you probably wouldn't expect, being the TVs that people play the games on. Back then, TVs were what we call CRTs, otherwise known as cathode ray tubes. Without getting too into the nitty-gritty, CRTs feature what's best described as a grid just barely beyond the screen, and in the very back of the TV is a laser. This laser emits light to certain locations on the grid to project the desired image, but it all can't be done at once. It moves at a speed undetectable to the human eye, yet upon rewatching video footage of a CRT in action, you're quick to notice what appears to be these lines going across the screen, as the electron laser shoots the desired image out onto the grid. This phenomenon is called scan lines, and is caused by the difference in what's called refresh rate between the CRT screen and the video camera. The way that CRTs are designed causes a faint level of blurriness to the image, however. The picture that's displayed upon a CRT won't be as sharp as something displayed on a modern-day HD monitor, for instance. Game developers took this blurring effect, which has since been dubbed as color bleed by the greater gaming community, and were able to design around it. You can take advantage of this color bleed to create what appears to be incredibly high-quality assets, while in reality they're quite basic. Take Donkey Kong Country, for instance. That game nowadays does not hold up the greatest on modern monitors, but using CRT filters and the sort, we're able to emulate what the developer's intention was. So, what does this have to do with Kirby? Well, this actually has everything to do with our intrepid hero, due to one tiny problem: visibility. Due to the color bleed phenomenon, developers weren't able to create incredibly small things for the player to keep track of. Well, rather, they could, but it'd be a massive pain in the ass. Smaller objects can often blend into backgrounds, and the challenge doesn't become positioning your character to dodge projectiles, as much as it is to find the character in the first place. This is a nuisance, and is likely a problem that plagued the shrink ability. And seeing as Kirby's Adventure is a game that was still meant to be enjoyed by all skill levels, an ability that was actively hard for the player to see, especially against the game's incredibly detailed backgrounds, would be, you guessed it, a massive pain in the ass. Unfortunately, the HUD portrait for the ability is nowhere to be found, but there are a few unused portraits found within the game's data. This first one's pretty uninteresting though. It's a duplicate of the invincibility icon, albeit in Japanese. I don't know why it's here, to be honest. It might have been slapped over the original shrink portrait so that it wasn't showing during the mixed silhouette, but I don't know much about how that works, so don't quote me on that. The next one is actually really interesting though, as it shows Kirby sitting in a cannon. Alright, so temper your expectations a bit. This wasn't a scrapped ability that would have seen Kirby using a cannon. Rather, this portrait was meant to appear when Kirby enters one of the cannons that can launch him into different areas. It doesn't appear in the final game under normal circumstances, though it can be seen during the mix silhouette, but it moves so quickly that most players wouldn't notice it without looking for it. What makes this piece more interesting is that the functionality was actually restored in the European version, and probably most famously, in the 3DS remaster of it, which is how I first learned about this years ago. I'm gonna take a break from the unused graphics to briefly discuss unused music, which the game has two notable pieces. The first one is something I noticed when I was younger as well. The game has a sound test, and track 16 has a song that isn't used anywhere in the final game. I'd tell you specifically what it is, but I'm sure you all will recognize it, so I'm just gonna play it and let you guess. That's right, it's the title theme from Kirby's Dream Land. This could mean one of two things. Either A, that the game was originally going to use this as the main theme and not have a new composition, or B, that this is a leftover from when the game was a simple NES port of Dreamland. I want to say that A makes the most sense. Based on how Sakurai talked about the game, I get the impression that the entire port a Game Boy game to an NES idea didn't get too far along before the shift in direction towards a full sequel happened. Nonetheless, far enough along to implement a title screen for it. This second track, however, isn't nearly as interesting, as it's not much of an unused track as it is a track that gets cut off in the final game, belonging to the Fountain of Dreams cutscene. I'll play it now, and pay attention to the screen too. I'll be marking which part is used and which isn't. Okay, so moving back into cut graphics, we have these unused tiles meant for a room where Kirby would use the light ability. Light is an ability that I have something of a soft spot for, since it is literally useless. But something I found when I replayed Adventure for this video is that its utility was far more limited than even I remembered. It is so useless as an ability that I thought I discovered something cool with it. Okay, so in World 7, Level 1, it starts with this dark room, where all the enemies are similarly shrouded in shadow. Now, for a brief period, I thought I was a badass and was going to make a new discovery. I was thinking that if I smuggle light from another level and use it here, it would reveal color and brighten this area up. So I went back to 4.6, got light, brought it with me, and used it. And would you believe it, nothing happened and I felt like a total dumbass. I'm incredibly disappointed. With this story in mind, I want to say that this tile set was likely meant for World 7 based on the Starry Night theme the world has. But I feel like it might have been meant for the first level since they're both dark. If I had to guess why it was scrapped, it probably has to do with the fact that it doesn't make any sense. How would light illuminate the stars in the background, for instance? If I were to illuminate that, then why does the rest of the background remain dark? I wish that it was used, that way light had more utility, yet here I am talking about it. With that in mind, it's entirely possible that the tile set was meant for an entirely scrapped stage, which brings us into our next cut graphic, a door graphic for the 7th stage in a world. In the final game, the maximum levels any individual world has is 6, making this go unused. This doesn't 100% mean that there's a cut level 7 somewhere, however, this could be an asset made solely just in case they end up designing a world with 7 stages. So I wouldn't really take this as concrete confirmation of anything, really. Since we're talking about the hub area, I need to get this one out of the way. An early HUD for the hub. HUD hub. Try saying that 5 times fast. HUD hub, HUD hub, HUD hub, hub, okay. It may be not, it's not as difficult as I thought it was going to be. Anyways, the hub area uses a different HUD than that while Kirby's in a stage, due to different information needing to be displayed. The different information pretty much comes down to the name of the world you're in, and world names get so long that a lot of the info seen in the level hub is simply moved down and shrunk. I used the unused tiles to create a rough recreation as to what this HUD would have looked like, but I didn't really know what the hell these tiles were meant to be for, so I didn't use them. But yeah, it looks very different when compared to the final game, most notably featuring a darker color palette, a different sprite to represent Kirby's lives, and a different, less detailed border. One of the most iconic aspects of Kirby's adventure are the minigames, and though I discussed how they came to be earlier, there are a few unused assets pertaining to 2 of them, being the Arena and Crane Fever. I'm gonna start with Crane Fever, since I think by most accounts that that's the most beloved minigame here. The unused stuff doesn't pertain to the plushes, but rather how many tries a player would be given. In the game's data, there's an unused stylized 3 in the style of the machine, and by changing a few bytes of code, it's possible to re-implement this behavior. If I had to guess, this would have been another difficulty modifier. In the final game, the game becomes more difficult by making the crane move much faster as you progress. But it could have originally done that and reduced the amount of tries you had. Better yet, it might have been a balancing thing. On the easiest difficulty, it's pretty easy to get the large Kirby plush with both tries, so they might have reduced the number of plays a player has to make it not so easy to farm lives. The next one involves the arena, which I guess is a half-truth, since it actually involves a handful of bosses that can be encountered in them. Mr. Frosty, Poppy Bros Sr., and Rolling Turtle all have a whopping 1 unused frame of animation each, showing them all in a considerable state of disarray. The Rolling Turtle one might show an unused behavior where he can hide in a shell or something, but there isn't any leftover code to remotely suggest that beyond the sprite, so we can't really say for sure. And even though I say that the Mr. Frosty one is unused, the cutting room floor claims that it is used, but it's just in an incredibly rare circumstance. You allegedly have to make him slam into a wall while he's preparing to use his ice throw attack, but I tried for well over 20 minutes and can't pull it off, so as far as I'm aware it isn't used. Though if you are able to replicate this behavior, let me know in the comments. Wrapping up unused graphics, we have a few unused tiles, as in 7 tiles depicting objects underwater. If you've played the game before, you might think you recognize a few of these actually, and I sure did, as these were seemingly meant to appear in Orange Ocean. There's a level where the player blows up a block, and it causes the lower section of the level to flood, so perhaps that was meant to have a more noticeable effect on the stage. So that does it for unused sprites, so now I'm going to move on to unused stage palettes. Okay, not all of them. I only want to discuss ones that I have something to say about. So here's all the unused ones that I don't have anything to say about at all. So I'm gonna go ahead and start with one of the more interesting ones, belonging to a warp zone. I didn't notice the difference at first, but if you look at the background, pay attention particularly to the colors of the clouds, you'll notice that the second layer from the bottom is purple in the unused palette, while in the final it's blue. The page for this on the cutting room floor speculates that this might have been a mistake, which is an assertion that I agree with. The transition from purple to blue in the final game is just strange and not natural. I vastly prefer this unused one. This one's just piss ugly. It makes the mountain area look like it's submerged in garbage water and pollution. Great change, I'm glad that this is unused. There's this variant of the forest palette that seems to be a night version. It's gorgeous in my opinion, so it sucks that it wasn't used. Speaking of sucking that it wasn't used, we have this unused palette for the museum areas, which also look really pretty. It would have been nice to have these and use some variety in colors in the museum areas, but I guess the devs disagreed, leaving it unused. There's this one that's an early version of 7-1's, except that the enemies are slightly brighter. It was probably changed to make them blend in with the dark colors of the stage more. The last of the palettes I'm going to mention is this one, which doesn't look important or anything, until we think back to pre-release materials. That's right, this palette looks like the one used in these screenshots. I don't really have much else to add other than it's cool that it's still in the game's data, so I'm going to move on to discussing unused rooms. Since I'm talking about unused rooms, I need to get this out of the way. Debug rooms suck. They are boring as hell, and I gain no enjoyment from hearing people talk about them online. So as you can probably imagine, I won't be talking about Kirby's Adventure's debug rooms here. However, if you are an absolute monster, no, I'm kidding. If you care about them and you want to hear about it, in the iCard I prepared a video of me exploring them for you guys to watch. I don't expect a lot of people, if anyone at all, to watch it, but it seems like a decent enough compromise between my disdain and uninterest for the topic, and those who like him, so go there if you want, I guess. Okay, moving on to actual unused rooms, we have quite a bit. First up, we have unused rooms that are just a little bit weird, just showing some floating platforms. These rooms aren't interesting until you pair them with some unused objects, that reveal that these are unused layouts for Meta Knight arenas. These two rooms still have their spawn data intact in the game's code, with this one missing theirs. As you can imagine, each of the actually used Meta Knight arenas have similar unused rooms in the game's data. These rooms likely weren't meant to actually appear in the final game. Rather, they were created to test the mini-bosses. Beyond those, we have a plethora of unused museum layouts. We have this one with Chili, this one with both Pinky and Chili, this one with a twister that was changed ever so slightly to become World 5's museum, and this one featuring both Sparky and Rocky. There's not really a lot to say about these, except for the fact that it appears that their level exit data is still intact, which might mean that these are remnants from an earlier World Hub? Then again, these could just be carrying over from actually used data, or just wholly corrupted data as a whole. There's one more unused museum that kinda supports this idea that it just sends Kirby to random locations, being this one that doesn't work properly. It spawns a Sir Kibble, but when Kirby inhales it, instead of getting him the expected cutter ability, it gives him the needle ability, which is strange in of itself. But what's even weirder is that when Kirby leaves the room, it sends him straight to 7-6, right on top of the button. So I'm leaning more towards the idea of the data being literal garbage, rather than being indicative of anything important. These last two rooms are the most interesting, and probably the only interesting thing from the debug room, both being unused puzzle areas. This first one has Kirby use the hammer or stone ability to slam down a peg, then get the laser ability to shoot at the diagonal platform, where it'll reflect off the platforms, ignite the fuse, and send Kirby to the desired location. Then we have this room that's yet another peg puzzle, where Kirby uses the hammer to cause some bricks to detonate, allowing a 1-up or Maxim tomato that wasn't programmed in to fall down, where Kirby has to race to grab it before it falls into a pit. These areas don't have much interesting beyond just being scrapped puzzle areas. However, the first one is notable for being the only ice area that uses a background that's light blue, as all the finals use darker areas. But beyond that, I don't really have much else to say. Now to wrap this video up, we have a few unused objects to look at, 2 to be exact. The game has a lot more left in the code, but most of it's just enemies moving at a faster or slower speed, so I picked the 2 most interesting ones to mention here. First, we have the switch, but a variant that was meant to appear on the ceiling. In the final game, there are a few areas that hide the exit to the switch area directly behind the switch. So part of me wants to believe that the switch was meant to be used in those areas, but I can't say for sure. The final unused object, and the last thing I'll be discussing in today's video, needs a little bit of explanation. So, in the final game, there are a few abilities that can only be granted by bosses. These are Backdrop, Throw, Mic, Crash, and the one of interest, Hammer. Hammer is probably one of Kirby's most famous abilities. since in later games, it is overpowered as hell. But in Adventure, it's pretty modest. It's not super great since it's much slower than Sword, and it also doesn't grant defensive traits like Parasol, but it's an ability that can still be used underwater, which puts it a mark above the rest. With this in mind, it's a bit weird that Hammer, of all abilities, is locked behind hunting down a Bonkers, right? Well, based on unused data, it seems that originally a normal enemy was meant to give Kirby this ability as well, and it's just not any old enemy either. It's one we've already discussed in this exact video. Okay, go back to the pre-release section right quick. Remember this beach screenshot? It's notable since it shows a Mace Knight appearing outside of its usual area. But what if I told you that this enemy isn't a Mace Knight? Upon closer inspection, several differences are clear. The colors are totally off, as the final one appears purple, though this one appears yellow. And the most important difference for this argument, that the sprite is totally different. No frames of the Mace Knight enemy in the final game come remotely close to resembling it as it appears here. There are sprites that strike the same pose, but the helmet is totally different, and this enemy is notably shorter than the final game's Mace Knight. With all of this in mind, I think that we can somewhat easily conclude that this enemy was an early version of Mace Knight, who was eventually redesigned to look more similar to his other Meta Knight counterparts. With all of this said, what the hell does this have to do with Hammer? Well, in the final game, there is an unused room for a Hammer museum area, and not just unfinished like the previous ones. This one has an entire portrait actually over the pedestal, implying that it was in a much further state than the previously discussed rooms. The only thing missing is an enemy, which has behaviors programmed in, but is missing sprites. Well, if one were to load in sprites of Meta Knight soldiers, you'll never believe what happens. Mace Knight has functioning animations associated with this enemy ID, and loads himself in the position of the enemy, which leads me to the conclusion that in earlier versions of the game, this mysterious Helmet Joe gave Kirby the Hammer ability before being redesigned to become the final game's Mace Knight and having its hammer properties entirely removed. Isn't that neat? I just think that's cool as hell. I didn't come to this conclusion until I'm literally just writing this, well, I guess recording this. So yeah, I just think that's one of the coolest potential discoveries I've made so far.
And that does it for the development of Kirby's Adventure. And to be honest, guys, it's a little hot in here. Why can't I move my arm? Ah! Guys, I don't know what's going on. Maybe if I go to sleep, I'll wake up and feel just better. I'm gonna go to bed. See you guys in the morning. I'll let you know how it's going.
The next morning.
Son of a bitch.